The strange thing about dying in the Arctic is that it doesn't feel dramatic at first. Ethan Walker whispered those words into the freezing wind as he forced himself forward through snow that reached almost to his knees. The temperature had fallen to nearly minus 96 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in less than 2 minutes. And somewhere beneath the endless white darkness, the sea ice groaned like an old wooden ship ready to split apart. His GPS had stopped working an hour ago. The screen was now nothing but a black slab of frozen glass inside his glove. His emergency radio had died shortly after that. Even the backup batteries he kept taped against his chest for warmth were useless now. The cold had swallowed everything. Ethan pulled his hood tighter as another blast of Arctic wind slammed into him hard enough to nearly knock him sideways. He could barely feel his hands anymore. Every breath stabbed his lungs like needles. Frost had formed across his eyelashes so thick that blinking felt like sandpaper scraping across his eyes. Somewhere behind him, buried beneath drifting snow and darkness, his shelter had collapsed during the storm. He had watched the aluminum frame bend in half before the wind carried the fabric away like paper. That had been almost 3 miles back. 3 miles might as well have been 300 now. He stopped walking for a second and looked into the white void ahead. Nothing. No lights. No mountains. No horizon. Just snow and darkness blending together until the entire world looked erased. Most people would have panicked by now, but Ethan felt strangely calm. That was the part that scared him most. He had spent years chasing dangerous places after the accident. Mountain ranges, frozen oceans, empty wilderness where nobody could hear you scream if something went wrong. His friends used to call him fearless, but the truth was simpler than that. Fear only matters when you care if you survive. Ethan stumbled again, catching himself with one shaking hand against the ice. He reached into his coat pocket and touched the photograph folded inside. Even through 2 layers of gloves, he could feel the worn edges of the picture. He didn't pull it out. He never did anymore. Another gust screamed across the Arctic plain, stronger this time, carrying tiny shards of ice that stung against his face. Then he heard it, a deep crunch somewhere behind him. Slow, heavy. Ethan froze instantly. The sound came again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Not ice shifting. Footsteps. Massive ones. His pulse quickened for the first time all night. He turned slowly, his boots grinding against the snow beneath him, and at first he saw nothing except blowing white powder spinning through darkness. Then a shape emerged. Huge, pale, moving silently through the storm. A polar bear. No, not one. 3 of them. Ethan's chest tightened as the animals stepped closer through the white haze, their fur almost glowing beneath the faint Arctic moonlight hidden behind the clouds. The largest one walked in front, enormous shoulders rolling beneath thick white fur, black eyes fixed directly on him. 2 smaller bears followed several feet behind. Cubs. Ethan's frozen fingers immediately reached for the flare gun attached to his backpack strap. He grabbed the handle, but his hand barely worked anymore. His fingers twitched uselessly against the trigger. The mother bear kept approaching. 30 feet away now. 20. Ethan could hear the animal breathing over the wind. Hot clouds of vapor drifted from its mouth into the freezing darkness. His heartbeat pounded so hard he could hear it inside his hood. He knew exactly how fast a polar bear could move. Faster than any human in deep snow. If it wanted him dead, there would be nothing he could do about it. The bear stopped less than 15 feet away and stared at him in complete silence. Snow swirled between them. Ethan slowly lowered the flare gun. His arm felt too heavy to hold up anymore. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Then something happened that made no sense at all. The polar bear turned around. Not frightened, not aggressive, calm. It looked back at him once, then slowly began walking toward a jagged wall of ice disappearing into the storm. Ethan frowned in confusion, struggling to stay conscious as exhaustion dragged at every part of his body. The 2 cubs followed their mother without hesitation. 10 seconds later, the animals vanished completely into the white darkness. Ethan stood there trembling, trying to understand what had just happened. Then another blast of wind hit him so hard that he nearly collapsed again, and somewhere deep inside his mind, a dangerous thought appeared. What if the bear hadn't been leaving? What if it wanted him to follow? Ethan stared into the white storm where the polar bears had disappeared, trying to decide whether the cold was finally making him hallucinate. Nothing about what had just happened felt real. Polar bears did not invite people anywhere. Every survival manual he had ever read said the same thing about them. If one decided to approach you, it usually meant trouble. But the mother bear had looked directly at him before walking away, almost like she expected him to follow. Another violent gust tore across the ice field, nearly spinning him sideways. Snow blasted against his face so hard it felt like sand striking exposed skin. Ethan dropped to one knee, coughing into his scarf as dizziness rolled through him again. He knew the warning signs now. The exhaustion, the strange calm, the overwhelming urge to sit down and rest for just a minute. Hypothermia had a way of making death feel comfortable. Somewhere beneath his layers, his body was already beginning to shut itself down to conserve heat. He forced himself back to his feet and looked toward the direction the bears had gone. Nothing but darkness and blowing snow. Then, for a split second, he saw movement again. A large pale shape standing farther ahead near a jagged wall of ice. Waiting. Ethan swallowed hard. His rational mind told him this was insane. Following predators into a storm in the middle of the Arctic was the kind of decision that got people killed. But staying where he was would kill him too. The difference was that the cold would do it slowly. He adjusted the straps on his backpack and began walking. Every step felt heavier now. His boots sank deep into fresh drifts while the wind pushed against him with relentless force. The ice beneath him groaned and cracked somewhere far below, a low haunting sound that echoed through the frozen darkness like whale calls underwater. Ethan kept his eyes locked on the distant shape ahead. Sometimes the bear disappeared entirely behind curtains of blowing snow, then reappeared a few seconds later farther along the ridge. It never rushed, never looked aggressive. It simply kept moving at a pace he could barely manage to follow. After several minutes, the terrain began to change. Massive slabs of broken ice rose from the snow like frozen waves, some taller than houses, their surfaces glowing pale blue beneath the weak Arctic moonlight hidden above the storm clouds. The wind became slightly weaker here, blocked by the jagged formations. Ethan stumbled between two towering walls of ice and suddenly saw the mother bear standing less than 30 feet away beside a narrow opening in the snow. Two cubs huddled behind her. Ethan froze instantly. The bear watched him in complete silence, its dark eyes reflecting faint light from the storm around them. For one terrifying moment, neither of them moved. Ethan could hear his own breathing inside his hood, ragged and uneven. Then the mother bear slowly turned and disappeared through the opening. One of the cubs followed immediately. The second paused for half a second, glancing back toward Ethan before vanishing inside too. Ethan stepped closer carefully, his pulse hammering. The opening led downward beneath the ice ridge into a shallow cave carved by wind and drifting snow. Warm air drifted faintly from inside. Not warm enough to feel comfortable, but warmer than the deadly storm outside. Ethan stared into the darkness of the shelter and realized something impossible. The bears had led him here. He should have turned around. Every instinct told him to back away before the animals changed their minds. But another wave of dizziness nearly knocked him off balance again. His legs were trembling uncontrollably now. He would not survive much longer out in the open. Slowly, Ethan crouched near the entrance and peered deeper inside. The cave extended farther beneath the ice than he expected, wide enough for the bears to rest together away from the wind. The cubs were already curled against the far wall, their thick white fur blending almost perfectly with the snow around them. The mother bear stood between Ethan and the cubs, enormous and silent, watching his every movement. Ethan carefully removed one glove and pressed his numb fingers against the ice wall beside him. Even inside the shelter, the surface burned with cold. But compared to outside, this place felt almost survivable. He looked at the bear again. The animal did not growl, did not move toward him. It simply watched. Snow swirled violently outside the cave entrance now, the storm growing louder by the second. Ethan knew he had maybe one choice left. He took a slow breath and stepped inside. The moment Ethan stepped fully into the ice cave, the sound of the storm changed. Outside, the Arctic wind had screamed like it wanted to tear the entire world apart. But inside the shelter, the noise became distant and muffled, like thunder buried beneath layers of snow. He stayed near the entrance at first, barely breathing, his eyes locked on the mother bear standing several feet away. The animal was enormous inside the confined space. bigger than he realized out on the ice. Its shoulders nearly brushed the curved ceiling of packed snow and frozen earth, and every slow breath that left its nose drifted through the cold air like smoke. The two cubs remained curled together near the back wall, their bodies rising and falling gently as they rested. Ethan could not understand why none of them seemed afraid of him. He slowly lowered his backpack onto the ground and winced as sharp pain shot through his fingers. The numbness was beginning to fade, and that meant the real agony was returning. He peeled off one glove carefully and stared at his hand. The skin across his knuckles looked pale and waxy beneath the dim blue light reflecting through the ice walls. Frostbite was setting in. He flexed his fingers slowly, forcing movement back into them while trying not to panic. The mother bear watched every motion. Ethan swallowed hard and sat down against the cave wall, keeping as much distance from the animals as possible. The floor beneath him was packed with old snow and surprisingly dry compared to the storm. Outside, even more surprising was the temperature. It was still brutally cold, but trapped body heat inside the shelter made it feel almost survivable. Ethan closed his eyes for 1 second and immediately felt exhaustion crash over him like a wave. He had not slept properly in nearly 2 days. His body wanted to shut down, but somewhere deep inside his mind, instinct kept screaming at him not to fall asleep beside 3 wild predators. So he forced himself awake by focusing on small details around him. The faint smell of salt and snow lingering in the cave, the low rumbling breaths of the bears, the distant cracking sounds of shifting sea ice far outside. Every few seconds, wind blasted across the cave entrance hard enough to send powdery snow drifting through the opening. Ethan pulled his coat tighter and looked again at the mother bear. She had finally laid down near the entrance, her massive body partially blocking the storm outside. One cub pressed against her side, while the other remained farther back, occasionally lifting its head to stare curiously at Ethan before settling down again. None of this made sense. He had spent enough time in remote wilderness to know nature did not work this way. Wild animals survive through instinct, not compassion. Especially here. Especially in conditions this brutal. Yet somehow, against every rule Ethan thought he understood about survival, he was sitting inside a polar bear den instead of freezing to death alone out on the ice. Another violent gust shook the cave walls, and for the first time that night, Ethan felt fear creeping into his thoughts again. Not fear of the bears, fear of himself, because now that he had stopped moving, memories were beginning to return. The silence inside the shelter left too much room for them. He reached slowly into his coat pocket and finally pulled out the photograph he had carried for almost 4 years. The edges were bent and faded from countless trips through rain, snow, and mountain storms. A little girl around 8 years old smiled back at him from the picture, bundled inside a red winter jacket with missing front teeth and bright blue eyes. Lily. Ethan stared at the photograph. While the storm roared outside the cave, he remembered the sound of her laugh more clearly than he remembered most people's faces now. He remembered how she used to beg him to take her camping every winter because she loved snow more than anything else in the world. After the accident, he had stopped unpacking her things, stopped calling old friends, stopped staying in one place long enough to think. Remote places were easier. Empty places. Places where nobody asked questions. Ethan rubbed one shaking thumb across the corner of the photograph before sliding it carefully back into his pocket. When he looked up again, one of the cubs was staring directly at him. The small bear tilted its head slightly, almost curious, before slowly inching closer to its mother. Ethan let out a quiet breath he did not realize he had been holding. Then suddenly the mother bear lifted her head. Every muscle in her body became still. The cave went silent except for the wind outside. Ethan frowned, sensing the shift immediately. The bear was listening to something beyond the storm. A low sound echoed faintly from somewhere outside the shelter. Not thunder. Not cracking ice. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Circling somewhere beyond the entrance. Ethan stopped breathing for a moment as the sound outside the cave came again. Slow footsteps pressed into the snow beyond the entrance, heavy enough that he could feel faint vibrations through the frozen ground beneath him. The mother bear rose immediately, her entire body tense now, ears angled toward the storm outside. One of the cubs pressed closer against her side, while the other let out a soft, nervous sound that echoed quietly through the shelter. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Whatever was out there had the attention of an animal that feared almost nothing in the Arctic. The footsteps circled once, then disappeared beneath the howl of the wind. Ethan strained to listen, barely daring to move. Every survival instinct told him to stay perfectly still. The cave suddenly felt much smaller than before. He glanced toward the narrow entrance where snow drifted in with each gust, then back toward the massive white animal standing between him and the storm. It hit him then how impossible this situation really was. Hours ago, he had been completely alone on the ice preparing to die. Now he was hidden inside a polar bear den while something unknown moved through the darkness outside. The mother bear released a low warning rumble deep in her chest. Not loud, just enough to make the cave vibrate faintly around them. Ethan had never heard a sound like it before. It did not sound angry. It sounded cautious. The footsteps stopped again. Silence settled over the cave except for the wind screaming outside. Ethan slowly reached into his backpack and pulled out a small flashlight. He pressed the button once. Nothing. Dead batteries. Of course. He laughed quietly under his breath, the sound dry and exhausted. Even now, after years of surviving impossible environments, part of him still expected equipment to save him. But the Arctic did not care how prepared you thought you were. The Arctic stripped everything down to instinct. Warmth, shelter, survival. Nothing else mattered here. Ethan leaned his head back against the ice wall and closed his eyes briefly. He could feel warmth radiating faintly from the bears nearby, enough to keep the cave from turning into a frozen tomb. His body had stopped shivering as violently now, which should have comforted him, but it did the opposite. He knew enough about hypothermia to recognize the danger. When shivering stopped, it often meant the body was running out of energy to fight the cold. He forced himself to stay awake by counting breaths. 1, 2, 3. The cave suddenly shook as another powerful gust slammed against the ridge outside. Snow fell from the ceiling in soft, powdery streams. One of the cubs lifted its head sharply and moved closer toward Ethan before quickly stopping halfway between them. Ethan froze, afraid even the slightest movement might scare it or provoke the mother. The cub stared at him curiously with dark eyes that reflected faint blue light from the ice walls. Up close, it looked younger than he expected. Smaller too, probably not even a year old yet. Ethan slowly lowered his gaze, trying not to appear threatening. The cub sniffed the air cautiously, then turned back toward its mother and settled down again. Ethan released a slow breath through his scarf. Outside, the storm intensified. Wind screamed across the ice, so loudly now it almost sounded human. Ethan checked his watch out of habit, but the display had frozen hours ago. He had no idea how much time had passed since entering the cave. Maybe 30 minutes. Maybe several hours. Time behaved strangely in extreme cold. Everything blurred together into survival and exhaustion. His thoughts drifted again despite himself. He remembered the last real conversation he had with Lily before the accident. She had asked him if polar bears ever got lonely living so far from people. Ethan had laughed back then and told her animals did not think about loneliness the way humans did. Now, sitting in silence beside this family of bears while the storm tried to bury the world outside, he was no longer sure that answer had been true. The mother bear suddenly turned her head toward him. Ethan stiffened immediately. The animal studied him for several seconds, calm but alert, before lowering herself back near the entrance again. Almost like she had decided he belonged there now. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. No aggression, no threat display, just quiet acceptance. It made no sense. Then, through the roar of the storm outside, another sound echoed faintly across the ice. A distant crack unlike the others before it. Louder, deeper. The entire cave trembled beneath them. Ethan's eyes widened instantly. He knew that sound. Sea ice shifting. Somewhere nearby, part of the frozen surface outside was beginning to break apart. The deep cracking sound rolled across the Arctic like distant thunder, followed by another violent tremor beneath the cave floor. Snow drifted from the ceiling again, dusting Ethan's shoulders and hair in icy powder. His eyes snapped toward the entrance while the mother bear immediately stood up once more, alert and tense. Outside, somewhere beyond the storm and darkness, the frozen ocean was shifting. Ethan had heard sounds like that before during expeditions near unstable sea ice. Sometimes it meant nothing. Sometimes it meant entire sections of ice were separating and drifting into open water. In weather like this, nobody would even see it happen until it was too late. The cave fell silent again except for the wind. Ethan carefully pushed himself upright against the wall, fighting through stiffness spreading through his legs. He needed to stay awake, needed to keep circulation moving. But exhaustion clung to him like a weight pulling him deeper towards sleep. The warmth trapped inside the den made it even harder to resist. For the first time in hours, he was no longer fighting constant freezing wind. The quiet almost felt dangerous. He looked toward the entrance again. Snow had piled higher now, narrowing the opening even more. If the storm continued at this pace, the entire entrance could seal shut before morning. The thought should have terrified him, but strangely, it did not. Not completely. A few feet away, the cubs had relaxed again, curled together beside their mother. One occasionally lifted its head whenever the ice groaned outside, then settled back down against the thick white fur beside it. Ethan watched them carefully, still unable to understand why they tolerated his presence. He had spent enough years around wildlife to recognize stress signals in animals. Defensive posture, agitation, restlessness. But the mother bear no longer looked ready to attack. If anything, she seemed focused on the storm beyond the cave more than him. Ethan slowly removed his outer gloves again and rubbed warmth back into his aching fingers. The pain was sharper now, needles of fire stabbing through his skin as circulation returned. He flexed his hands carefully and noticed the trembling had become worse. Fatigue, cold stress, dehydration. He reached into his pack and pulled out the last unopened water pouch he had left. The liquid inside had partially frozen into slush. Ethan unscrewed the cap and took a small sip, forcing himself not to drink too fast. Then he paused. One of the cubs was watching him closely again. Ethan stared at the animal for a second before doing something he would later realize was completely absurd. He gently pushed the pouch a few inches across the snow toward the cub. The mother bear lifted her head immediately. Ethan froze. The cave became perfectly still. Then, after several long seconds, the cub cautiously leaned forward and sniffed the frozen pouch before losing interest and curling back against its sibling. Ethan let out a shaky breath and quietly laughed under it. Maybe the cold really was affecting his brain now. Outside, the storm screamed harder than ever. Wind slammed against the ice ridge with enough force to make the walls vibrate faintly around them. Ethan checked his watch again out of habit, even though the screen remained dead. He had no idea whether it was midnight or 3 in the morning. The Arctic darkness made time meaningless. Hours could vanish without warning out here. His thoughts drifted again despite himself. He remembered sitting in a hospital waiting room years earlier while snow fell outside the windows in soft, silent flakes. A nurse had handed him a paper cup of coffee he never drank. People spoke to him that night, but afterward he could barely remember any words. Only silence. Endless silence after everything that mattered disappeared. Ethan had spent years trying to outrun that silence. That was the truth he never admitted to anyone. Every dangerous expedition, every frozen mountain, every isolated place on Earth, none of it had really been about adventure. It had been easier to face storms than grief. Easier to challenge nature than sit alone with memories. Another cracking boom echoed across the ice outside, louder this time. The cubs startled instantly. The mother bear rose so quickly that Ethan's pulse jumped. She moved toward the cave entrance and stood there listening into the darkness while snow whipped violently past outside. Then Ethan heard something else beneath the wind. A low, distant sound that did not belong to shifting ice. Engines. Very faint, barely audible through the storm. Ethan straightened immediately, heart pounding. He crawled closer toward the entrance, trying to listen without alarming the bear. There it was again, somewhere far away beyond the white darkness. A helicopter rotor. Rescue crews. They were still searching for him. Relief flooded through Ethan so suddenly it almost hurt. But the sound faded quickly beneath the storm until he could no longer tell if he had really heard it at all. The mother bear remained perfectly still at the entrance, staring into the blizzard outside. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, she backed deeper into the cave again. And a few seconds later, the sound of the helicopter disappeared completely. Ethan stayed awake by forcing himself to focus on sound. The wind outside, the slow breathing of the bears, the distant groaning of the ice shifting beneath the frozen ocean. Every few minutes, another deep crack echoed somewhere across the Arctic darkness, reminding him how fragile the world outside the cave really was. He had survived storms before, but this one felt different. Bigger somehow, as if nature itself had decided to erase everything moving across the ice tonight. The entrance to the den had narrowed even more now. Snow drifted steadily into the opening with every violent gust, slowly sealing the shelter away from the outside world. Ethan crawled a little closer and peered through the blowing white haze beyond the entrance. Visibility was almost gone. The storm had swallowed everything. No stars, no moonlight, just endless darkness and moving snow. If rescue crews were still searching, they would never see this place in conditions like these. The realization settled heavily into his chest. He might truly be trapped here until morning, or longer. Behind him, one of the cubs shifted and released a soft, sleepy sound. Ethan glanced back and noticed the smaller cub watching him again. This time it did not seem nervous. Curious maybe. The cub slowly stretched its neck toward him, sniffing the air cautiously before settling down once more beside its sibling. Ethan shook his head slightly in disbelief. If anyone had described this situation to him a week ago, he would have laughed in their face. Yet here he was, sharing warmth inside an Arctic den with the very animals he had spent years respecting from a safe distance. The mother bear remained near the entrance, alert even while resting. Every few seconds her ears twitched toward the storm outside. Ethan could tell she was listening constantly, waiting for something. Another violent tremor suddenly rolled through the ice beneath them, stronger than before. Ethan grabbed the cave wall instinctively as loose snow fell from the ceiling in thick powder. Outside, a long cracking roar echoed across the darkness like thunder tearing through glass. The cubs startled awake immediately. The mother bear stood so quickly that her head nearly brushed the cave ceiling. Ethan's pulse jumped. He knew that sound too well now. A pressure fracture. Somewhere nearby, part of the sea ice had broken open. For several tense seconds, the cave remained perfectly still except for the storm. Then Ethan heard it. Water. Very faint at first. A deep sloshing sound beneath the ice somewhere outside. His stomach tightened instantly. If the crack had opened too close to the ridge, this entire section of ice could become unstable. He imagined black Arctic water churning beneath them, cold enough to stop a human heart within minutes. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with temperature. The mother bear suddenly moved deeper into the cave, guiding the cubs farther from the entrance with gentle nudges. Ethan watched carefully, realizing the animal was reacting to danger before he fully understood it himself. Instinct. Survival. Nature always sensed changes faster than humans did. Another crack boomed outside, followed by a low grinding noise beneath the frozen ground. Ethan crawled toward the entrance again despite every part of him screaming not to. He needed to know how bad things were becoming. Snow blasted against his face immediately as he leaned closer to the opening. Through the white chaos outside, he barely made out dark shapes moving in the distance. Ice shifting. Massive slabs grinding slowly against one another beneath the storm. Then he saw something that made his chest tighten. A narrow black line cutting across the snowfield about 50 yards away. Open water. The fracture had reached the surface. Ethan pulled back into the cave quickly, heart racing now. If the crack spread beneath the ridge, the den itself could collapse or drift apart from the larger ice shelf entirely. They were no longer just hiding from the storm. They were sitting on unstable ice in the middle of a frozen ocean. The mother bear stared directly at him as he moved away from the entrance again. For one strange moment, Ethan almost felt as though the animal understood the danger too. The cubs curled tightly beside her while the storm continued roaring outside like some living thing circling the shelter. Ethan leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes briefly. His body ached with exhaustion. His fingers burned painfully as circulation slowly returned. But beneath all of that, another feeling had started growing inside him. Something unfamiliar after years of numbness. He realized he wanted to survive this night. Not out of pride. Not for another expedition story. For the first time in years, he genuinely wanted to see morning again. Ethan reached into his coat and touched the photograph in his pocket once more. Then suddenly the mother bear lifted her head sharply toward the entrance. A new sound drifted faintly through the storm outside. Different this time. Closer. Engines again. Much louder than before. The sound grew louder through the storm until Ethan no longer questioned whether he was imagining it. Rotor blades. Somewhere above the white darkness, a rescue helicopter was fighting its way through the blizzard. Ethan shot upright so quickly that dizziness hit him immediately. He grabbed the ice wall to steady himself while his pulse thundered inside his ears. They were close. Closer than before. For the first time all night, hope hit him hard enough to hurt. He crawled toward the cave entrance and peered outside into the storm. Snow blasted against his face instantly, freezing against his eyelashes and scarf. Visibility remained terrible, but now faint flashes of light flickered somewhere above the clouds, barely visible through the blowing snow. Searchlights. Ethan's chest tightened. They had not given up on him. Somewhere out there, pilots were risking their lives trying to find one man lost on unstable Arctic ice in the middle of the worst storm of the season. Ethan reached for the emergency flare gun strapped to his pack. His hands trembled violently as he pulled it free. This was his chance. One flare into the sky, and they might see him. One signal, and this nightmare could finally end. But just as he shifted closer to the entrance, the mother bear moved instantly between him and the storm. Ethan froze. The animal stood directly in front of him now, massive shoulders filling half the narrow opening. Snow swirled around her thick white fur while she stared outside with complete focus. Ethan tightened his grip on the flare gun, confused at first. Then he heard it. Another deep crack split through the ice somewhere nearby, louder than anything before. The ground beneath the cave trembled violently. Snow collapsed from the ceiling in thick sheets. One of the cubs cried out softly behind them. Ethan pressed himself against the cave wall as another rumbling boom echoed across the frozen ocean. The helicopter sound faded slightly above the storm, drowned beneath the chaos outside. Then Ethan understood. If he fired the flare now and rushed outside, he would be stepping directly onto unstable ice in near-zero visibility. One wrong step into a hidden fracture, and nobody would ever find him. The mother bear remained completely still at the entrance, watching the storm like she sensed dangers humans could not yet see. Ethan slowly lowered the flare gun. His breathing shook harder now, partly from cold, partly from emotion he could no longer control. He looked at the animal standing in front of him and realized something impossible. She was not blocking him from leaving. She was stopping him from walking into danger. Ethan leaned his head back against the ice and shut his eyes tightly for a second. His throat burned unexpectedly. He had spent years believing the world no longer cared whether he lived or disappeared. After Lily died, everything had become distant. Friends stopped calling eventually because he stopped answering. Holidays became just another date to survive. Even these expeditions had started feeling less like exploration and more like punishment. But tonight, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by ice and darkness, something had changed. A wild animal that owed him nothing had chosen not once, but repeatedly, to keep him alive. The realization cracked something open inside him that he had kept buried for years. Ethan lowered his face into his shaking hands. Before he could stop himself, tears finally came. Quiet at first, then harder. Not panic, not fear, grief. The kind he had spent years outrunning across mountains, oceans, and frozen wilderness. The storm outside continued roaring while Ethan sat there inside the cave, trying to breathe through memories he had refused to face for too long. He remembered Lily sitting on his shoulders during their last family camping trip, laughing because snowflakes kept landing on her nose. He remembered promising her they would visit the Arctic together someday when she got older. He remembered the hospital room after the accident felt colder than any place on Earth ever could. One of the cubs slowly wandered closer while Ethan wiped his face with trembling gloves. The small bear stopped only a few feet away, staring curiously at him. Ethan let out a shaky laugh under his breath at the absurdity of it all. Somewhere above them, the helicopter passed again, distant and fading through the storm. This time Ethan did not move toward the entrance. He simply listened to it disappear into the darkness while the mother bear remained standing guard beside him. Then suddenly her posture changed again, completely rigid, every muscle tense. Ethan followed her gaze toward the storm outside just as a new sound echoed faintly across the ice. Not engines, not shifting ice. A long low call drifting through the blizzard somewhere beyond the cave. The sound echoed again through the storm outside the cave, long and low, carried across the frozen darkness by the wind. Ethan could not tell exactly how far away it was, But every reaction inside the den changed instantly. The cubs pressed tightly against their mother while the massive bear moved toward the entrance once more, completely alert now. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had spent enough years in remote wilderness to recognize when animals sensed danger before humans did. Whatever had made that sound was close enough to put even a polar bear on edge. Another distant call drifted across the ice, slightly louder this time. Ethan slowly crawled toward the entrance beside the mother bear, careful not to move too quickly. Snow blasted through the narrow opening, freezing instantly against his jacket and face. Beyond the shelter, the storm still swallowed almost everything, but the darkness no longer looked empty. Shapes moved out there now. Large shadows shifting through curtains of blowing snow far across the fractured ice. Ethan strained his eyes, trying to focus through the storm. Then lightning flashed silently somewhere beyond the clouds, illuminating the frozen landscape for half a second. It was enough. He saw at least two massive figures moving along the ridge near the open fracture in the ice. Polar bears. Adult males. Ethan's chest tightened instantly. He knew enough about Arctic wildlife to understand why the mother bear had become defensive. Male bears sometimes wandered enormous distances searching for food during severe winter conditions, especially when storms disrupted hunting patterns across the sea ice. The two shadows disappeared again into darkness as the storm swallowed them whole. The mother bear released another deep, warning rumble that vibrated through the cave floor beneath Ethan's knees. He slowly backed away from the entrance, gripping the flare gun tighter even though he knew it would probably do little against animals that size. But strangely, fear no longer felt like the strongest emotion inside him. Hours earlier he would have panicked. Now he found himself watching the mother bear instead. Watching how she positioned herself between the cave opening and her cubs. Watching how every instinct inside her focused entirely on protection. Ethan swallowed hard as an unexpected thought hit him. She was doing exactly what he had once promised Lily he would always do for her. Outside, another crack split through the frozen ocean, followed immediately by a powerful gust that blasted snow deep into the cave. The cubs startled again. One of them stumbled awkwardly toward Ethan before quickly retreating beside its mother. Ethan lowered his gaze, trying to appear calm despite the adrenaline surging through his body. The storm seemed endless now. Every minute stretched longer than the last. Then suddenly the cave brightened for a split second. Ethan looked up sharply. A powerful beam of white light swept across the storm outside before vanishing again. Searchlights. The helicopter had returned, this time much closer. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. The sound of rotor blades slowly emerged through the wind again, louder than ever before. Rescue crews were directly overhead now. Ethan crawled toward the entrance instinctively, flare gun in hand. But the moment he reached the opening, the ice beneath the cave trembled violently. A thunderous cracking roar exploded somewhere nearby. Ethan lost balance and slammed one shoulder against the wall as snow collapsed heavily from the ceiling. Outside, the fractured line across the ice widened visibly, black Arctic water surging beneath broken slabs of frozen ocean. Ethan stared in shock. Part of the ridge outside had started separating completely. The helicopter lights swept overhead again, briefly illuminating the chaos beneath them. Jagged ice drifting apart, blowing snow. Dark water opening through the frozen surface like a wound in the earth. No pilot could safely land near this place. The mother bear remained completely still beside the entrance, refusing to move despite the shifting ice. Ethan realized then why she had stayed hidden through the entire storm. The den sat on one of the few stable sections left along the ridge. Somehow, through instinct alone, she had chosen the safest place for survival hours before the fractures spread across the ocean. The helicopter circled once more above the storm. Ethan raised the flare gun slowly, his frozen fingers trembling around the trigger. This was his chance. Maybe his only chance. But just before he fired, one of the cubs let out a frightened sound behind him. Ethan turned instinctively. Snow was beginning to collapse deeper into the back of the cave now as the ridge shifted beneath them. The cubs were trapped against the rear wall, while the mother bear remained focused on the danger outside. Ethan stared at them for one stunned second while the helicopter lights swept overhead again. Then, without fully understanding why, he lowered the flare gun and crawled deeper into the collapsing cave toward the cubs instead. The cave shook again as Ethan crawled deeper through falling snow toward the trapped cubs. Ice cracked loudly somewhere beneath the ridge, followed by the deep, grinding sound of frozen slabs shifting against one another in the dark. Snow poured from the ceiling in heavy streams now, partially blocking the back of the den where the cubs huddled together. Ethan shoved the flare gun into his jacket and dropped to his knees beside them, ignoring the freezing pain shooting through his hands. One cub pressed itself tightly against the wall, while the other struggled awkwardly in the collapsing snow. Ethan reached forward carefully, his heart pounding. The smaller cub froze instantly at his touch, wide dark eyes fixed on him while the cave trembled again. Behind him, the mother bear released a low warning sound toward the storm outside. Ethan glanced back and saw her still guarding the entrance, enormous against the swirling white darkness beyond the cave. The helicopter lights flashed overhead again, brighter this time, sweeping across the fractured ice outside. Search crews were almost directly above them now. Ethan turned back toward the cubs and cleared snow away from their legs with shaking hands. His fingers barely worked anymore, stiff from cold and exhaustion, but adrenaline kept him moving. The smaller cub finally pulled free and stumbled closer against its sibling. Ethan leaned back against the wall, breathing hard while loose snow continued falling around them. Then suddenly the entire ridge lurched violently beneath the cave. A deafening crack exploded outside. Ethan grabbed the ice wall instinctively as part of the entrance collapsed inward. Wind and snow blasted through the opening in a freezing white wave. The cubs cried out softly and pressed against each other. Ethan looked up just in time to see the mother bear move fast across the cave, placing herself directly between the cubs and the collapsing entrance. Another section of ice split outside, revealing flashes of black water beneath drifting snow. The helicopter lights swung sharply across the ridge. Again, this time they stopped. Ethan's pulse surged. They had seen the collapse. A beam of white light locked onto the ridge above the cave entrance, cutting through the storm like daylight. Ethan scrambled for the flare gun inside his jacket and fired it upward through the opening. The red flare exploded into the storm above them, glowing brilliantly against the swirling snow. Seconds later, the sound of the helicopter changed. Lower now. Closer. Ethan could barely believe it. They were coming in. Through the roar of the storm, he heard voices faintly echoing over loudspeakers outside, distorted by wind and distance. Rescue crews shouting instructions he could not fully understand. The mother bear remained perfectly still beside the cubs while the helicopter circled overhead. Ethan stared at her through the blowing snow, overwhelmed by the impossible reality of the night. Every instinct told him this animal should have feared him or attacked him long ago. Instead, she had shared shelter, warmth, and survival through the deadliest storm Ethan had ever faced. Another powerful beam of light swept directly into the cave entrance. Ethan raised one arm instinctively to shield his eyes. Then a rescuer appeared at the top of the ridge outside, attached to a safety line against the violent wind. The man froze for half a second after spotting the bears inside the den. Ethan could only imagine what the scene looked like from outside. A missing explorer trapped inside a collapsing ice cave beside a family of polar bears during a blizzard. Ethan slowly raised both hands to show he was calm. The rescuers shouted something through the storm, motioning for Ethan to move toward the entrance. Ethan nodded weakly, but before standing, he looked back one final time at the mother bear and her cubs. The animal stared at him silently from the shadows of the cave, while snow drifted around her thick white fur. For one strange moment, everything outside the storm seemed to disappear. No helicopter, no cracking ice, no fear. Just silence between two living creatures who had somehow kept each other alive through the longest night of their lives. Ethan slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out Lily's photograph. The edges were damp now from melted snow and shaking hands. He looked at the smiling little girl in the picture, then back toward the cubs resting safely beside their mother. A quiet breath escaped him. "You were right," he whispered softly into the frozen darkness. Then Ethan carefully placed one glove against the icy wall of the cave and pulled himself toward the rescuers waiting outside. Hours later, wrapped in blankets inside the rescue helicopter, Ethan looked down through the window as dawn finally broke